I talked in yesterday's podcast about the man I called the second greatest Black American of our history, Booker T. Washington, second only to Frederick Douglass. And I want to talk today about an important debate between Booker T. Washington and sort of his great intellectual adversary, a fellow named W.E.B. Du Bois. This was an argument within Black America, which I think is very revealing, but revealing not just for Black America. Why? Because they're actually arguing, how does a group that starts out at the bottom make its way up the ladder? What is the best recipe for groups that are denied opportunity to succeed? And in this argument, Du Bois, who sort of starts it out, makes the claim that Blacks in America have one big problem: racism. Racism is, he says, and by the way, this is the racism of the Democratic Party, but nevertheless, racism is keeping Blacks down. They need to fight racism. How? Well, the phrase that Du Bois uses, and in fact, here he is borrowing from Frederick Douglass, is agitate, agitate, agitate. In other words, never stop struggling, fighting through politics to move up that way, forcing society, if you can, to yield to the demand for equal rights. Now, Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave, founded the Tuskegee movement, both a school as well as a kind of industrial education center. Booker T. Washington makes, I think, a very profound point. He says Blacks in America actually have two major problems. The first is indeed racism, but the second is Black cultural disadvantage. Cultural disadvantage that may come out of racism, but nevertheless takes on a kind of life of its own. And Booker T. Washington's point is that Blacks, in order to come up, have got to fight both. Why? Because let's say you're successful in fight number one. Let's say you're able to sort of establish equal rights under the law. What does that mean? Well, that means nothing more than the right to participate, the right to compete. But here's where Booker T. Washington has a second point to make. How do you compete effectively? Suddenly you're in a race where the prize is going to go to the guy who hits the finishing tape first. And this is true in education, it's true in economics, it's true by and large in any competitive society. And his point is that any group that's starting out behind has got to figure out ways to develop the skills, the competitive skills that enable it to advance. I want to read a couple of lines from Washington's Up From Slavery. I emphasize the fact that while the Negro should not be deprived by unfair means of the franchise, of the ballot, political agitation alone cannot save him. And that back of the ballot, meaning in addition to the ballot, he must have property, industry, skill, economy, intelligence, and character, and that no race without these elements can permanently succeed. In the same vein, here's Booker T. Washington. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercise of these privileges. Think of what he's saying. It's one thing to have the right to participate in the Olympics, but what if you can't run? It's one thing to have the right to be a programmer at Oracle Software, but what if you don't know how to do that? So Booker T. Washington's point is that it's one thing to have rights, but you also need to develop the cultural skills to take advantage of those rights. Now, all of this rhetoric greatly angered W.E.B. Du Bois, who kind of came back slashing at Booker T. Washington and said things like, I'm not going to quote Du Bois. He goes, because Booker T. Washington talked about the high crime rate among particularly young Black males. And Du Bois goes, suppose today the Negroes do steal. Who was it that for centuries made stealing a virtue by stealing their labor? Now you have to grant that Du Bois here has an important point. He's going, listen, Blacks weren't allowed to keep the fruits of their labor. In fact, slavery itself was a massive theft operation done on them. So where do you think they learned stealing? And Booker T. Washington replies, he goes, yeah, but, and now I'm paraphrasing him, so what? Booker T. Washington's point is, nevertheless, even though it is the case that oppression might have held us back in certain ways, the simple fact of it is we're going to have to figure out ways to get out of that. We can't make a habit of stealing be a characteristic marking trait of the black community, because that's going to hold us back. That's going to make other people who come along think, wow, these blacks are thieves. So Booker T. Washington's point is that even if oppression is the source of the cultural disadvantage, it is in the hands of blacks to overcome that disadvantage, and that must be their necessary task. Now, I mention all this because it seems to me that this was a kind of fork in the road for the civil rights movement. Du Bois, by the way, was one of the founders of the NAACP, one of the main civil rights organizations of the black community. And the NAACP from the beginning adopted the Du Boisian formula of agitate, agitate, agitate. By the way, Booker T. Washington's formula was different. Work, work, work. And today we may say that that was the road not taken. That was the road not taken by the civil rights leadership of the 1960s and since. If you think of people like Al Sharpton, you think of the leaders of the black community, they never demand of blacks that, hey, why are our families in this way? Why is it that the crime rate's so high? Why are there so many black on black murders in Chicago? How do we fix this within our community? There's almost no discussion of any of this. And it may seem that the Booker T. Washington formula has been completely forgotten. But I want to argue that, in fact, it is not. There are other groups that are operating right now on the Booker T. Washington model. And in fact, that is the key to their success. And who are those groups? These are the non-white immigrant groups. If you think about the Koreans, the Pakistanis, the Asian Indians, the West Indians, the Nigerians, all these immigrant groups coming to America, and ask yourself, what is the key to their success? How is it that they're able to move into the very same inner cities in which African Americans live, and then 15 years later, they've moved out to the suburbs. They moved into Washington, D.C. Now they're living in Arlington. And by the way, 10 years from now, they'll be living in Fairfax. And pretty soon they'll have a really nice house in McLean. And their kid's going to be going to Tulane or Vanderbilt. How does that happen? Well, the simple truth is it happens because they're following the Booker T. Washington formula. Work, work, work. In other words, don't just try to get society to conform to you. You conform to the cultural requirements of success. And so I think as we look at the Booker T. Washington-Du Bois debate, it isn't just a debate for African Americans. It's a debate for all of us. And what we realize is that you must agitate, agitate, and agitate until you get equal rights under the law. But once you do that, society has sort of done it for you. Now you have to do it for yourself. By the way, there's something Martin Luther King once said, which kind of gets to the heart of the matter. It's not the quote that most people know from Martin Luther King about the content of our character. It's this one. The Negro will only be free, I'm now quoting Martin Luther King, when he reaches down into the inner depths of his own being and signs with pen and ink of assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. So what is King saying? He's saying that we have a right to equal rights under the law. We do have that right, but we don't have any more rights than that. What we do with our rights, what we make of our liberties, the kind of person and groups that we make collectively through action, that ultimately is up to us.